It's my absolute pleasure today to be talking to Paul Warberg. And I know a lot of you in the audience have requested this episode. A lot of you will have looked forward to this content because Paul has rapidly emerged to produce some extraordinary content, which I think has gripped the activist community. I now see quotes from his episodes and references to his videos from a lot of people in the pro-Ukraine space and a lot of experts quoting it as well. So I think this is going to be absolutely fascinating. Expect a down-to-earth, thought-provoking insights from Paul. He is an independent, open-source geopolitical analyst in his own description. What I also want to do in this episode is find a little bit more about him and his motivations, because whereas I've seen quite a few videos and they're fantastic, I know relatively little about Paul and his background and motivations. So we'll get into that in a second. Before we do, thank you to everybody who supports Paul's channel and, of course, who supports my own as well, especially through Buy Me a Coffee, Patreon, etc. That kind of support doesn't just give us a bit of a morale boost, it also helps to keep this work going because as I think Paul understands, and Jake and the others in this community, I mean, these videos take an awful lot of time to plan, record, edit, promote, and all the rest of it. Paul, welcome to the channel.
Thanks, Jonathan. So happy to be here. And obviously, I've watched a lot of your videos, as has probably everybody in this space. So really happy to be having a conversation this morning.
Well, that's absolutely fantastic, and I always wonder what people sort of get out of the videos because for me, it's like sitting there and having a nice conversation in the pub. At least that's how I
Yes.
imagine it to kind of normalize it in my own head. Otherwise, it would be a bit weird having, Gary Kasparov in your little kid's second bedroom, which is where I record this from. Um, but what about you? I mean, what are your motivations to get into this, and how have you found your voice? Because you've established, I would say, authority, credibility quickly, and of course, you've got incredible performance of your recent videos as well.
Yeah, I had a kind of weird entrance into this whole world. When the war in Ukraine started, I would have probably described myself as apolitical in this, like in the sense that I didn't care about politics at all. I've always been a little frustrated by American politics and honestly seen it as kind of a waste of time. My background is actually that I'm a pastor, which not a lot of people know. I don't share a ton of details just because I don't like talking about myself, but obviously people want to know. So my background is that I'm a pastor, and that's where my education was. So it's a multidisciplinary education. You learn all sorts of things. You learn about a little bit about geopolitics, honestly, because you're learning about missions work and things like that. You're learning languages, ancient languages, Hebrew and Greek, but also a lot of history and how to connect a lot of information together. And so I've used that to study all sorts of different topics. And I've always loved learning. My learning has never stopped. Everywhere I go, I'm always carrying a book. And so the reason I got involved in the whole Ukraine thing really passionately really started because I had a cousin. He volunteered. He was an American soldier. He fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. He volunteered to go fight for Ukraine, and he actually ended up perishing out there. He was basically hunted down by a Russian drone. His story is rather heroic. He saved a lot of the guys he was training's lives because his drone dropped a chemical weapon, and he went to remove the chemical weapon from the rest of his troops, and he ended up perishing. And I'd been involved a little bit in creating videos about Ukraine prior to that, just kind of out of interest. But that's kind of where I think the tone started to change, and I started to take a little bit more seriously what was going on there, and kind of wanting to honor what he did. And over the years, obviously, I started as kind of an apolitical person, and so I kind of tried to steer clear of the politics. But as this war progresses, it's increasingly clear you can't do that. Unfortunately, war is inherently political, and so that has been the driving force in a lot of my content and a lot of the ramped up energy and a lot of the ramped up production and stuff in recent days, especially.
That's an extraordinarily moving story, and I have to say, not exactly the background story I was expecting there. But it makes a huge amount of sense because a friend of mine, Greg Terry, is a U.S. Evangelical pastor who's spent I think it's 20 or 30 years in Ukraine or flipping between the US and Ukraine. And again, he has an energy and a passion that is both driven not just by his belief, but there's that as well, but it's also driven by a sense that there is moral right, there's moral certainty, and that values, aren't this sort of postmodern sort of,
Exactly.
imagined kind of thing. They're real, and sometimes you have to put everything on the line for them. That sounds a little bit similar.
Yeah, and if I might say so, looking at American politics, because that's a lens I always look at things through my morals and not caring about really what political party happens to win. That I think also is why I approach things kind of the way I do. I don't really care who you are. I care if you do the right thing or not, and that's sort of how I judge people and how I judge events, or at least how I try to. Um, I know a lot of people might say that, but I always have this voice in the back of my head kind of pushing me even further in that direction, if that makes sense.
It absolutely makes sense. And well, we're going to talk about geopolitics, but I'm going to take a little bit
Yeah.
of a detour here. And this is a sensitive area. It's also an area where the weaponized propaganda, unfortunately, really does kind of cut through and actually has some effect, especially in the US. And that is when you have the claims that Russia is a deeply moral, deeply Christian country, that the Russian Orthodox Church somehow has a higher truth, and that it's being persecuted and eradicated in Ukraine. Of course, the reality, which I've seen with my own eyes, is that Ukraine is an extraordinarily religious country. In fact, the western part of Ukraine probably has more chapels and shrines and greater diversity of religions, rubbing shoulders and actually collaborating with each other than anywhere else in Europe, probably outside the Vatican. It's absolutely extraordinary. But from your perspective, why does this religious propaganda cut through? And of course, someone like Tucker Carlson is able to take that topic, and it really helps to leverage his position. And he also knows that's one of the things that is going to get traction. Whereas some of his other stuff, people look at it and go, "Yeah, really, that's not true."
Yeah, I think a lot of it, at least in America, from my experience, is a lot of Americans just don't know a whole lot about Europe in general, and especially Eastern Europe, right? Because America is such a big country. We have so much to learn about where we live. And there's so many states within our country. We just don't know much about what's going on out there. So when somebody like Tucker Carlson comes in and says certain things, we tend to believe that, and a lot of Americans don't look any further. And on the surface, of course, Tucker Carlson is a smart man in the sense that he knows he's going to be believed, and he knows there's certain aspects of what he's saying that if they're cherry picked, they seem true. When you say Ukraine is shutting down churches, and a lot of people aren't going to look any further than that. What a lot of American Christians, I think, do wrong is they focus on certain aspects of morality and not others. And so you look at certain things in Russia that you can't do that you can do in the United States, and people will say, well, they're more moral than us. And I would just remind people that, murder isn't moral. Invading countries without good reason isn't moral. Bombing apartment buildings and bombing hospitals isn't moral. You can't pick and choose. But a lot of, you see this a lot of all the time with dictatorships where they try to take up the Christian mantle when they don't really ascribe to Christian morality. It's just a tool in their propaganda to get people on their side. And in the case of the Russian Orthodox churches in particular, one of the things that we read about in the Bible is, not to bow the knee to Caesar when it comes to religion. And unfortunately, the Russian Orthodox Church has directly aligned themselves basically with the Russian government. And I think one of the reasons there's these warnings in the Bible, just from a Christian perspective, is when people take actions against your government, if your church is a tool in the arm of the government, because you've kind of disobeyed and or at least lacked wisdom in these things the Bible says on these matters, your church has become open to the same criticism that your government is open to. And that's a lot of what's happened with the Russian Orthodox Church. And in reality, when you look at, persecution of churches, you have to ask yourself, well, who's bombed more churches? Who's actually caused more harm to evangelicals, especially? And it's obviously Russia and Eastern Ukraine, and the way they've treated people there. So I think if more people just sat and thought about it, they would come to that conclusion. I just think a lot of people don't because we don't know much in America about these things, and we just have a proclivity to believe what we're told, unfortunately.
I mean, I like posing the question. I haven't had too many opportunities to pose it, which is, you know, what would someone who's perhaps fallen for those messages of Tucker Carlson say? How would you feel if senior clergy in every church in the US had to be a member of the FBI?
Oh,
I mean,
heck,
they would absolutely lose their minds, right? But that's the reality in Russia. They are KGB agents, and it's highly questionable whether there is anything spiritual about the upper echelons of the church. That also, unfortunately, almost certainly covers the Muslim faith as well, of which Russia has a huge number of adherents to that faith too.
yeah, one of the things I always say is when the church meshes with the state, it's not the state that is being used to advance the aims of the church. It's vice versa, always. Every time you look across history, and it's really important to understand that.
Well, let's turn to geopolitics because, again, Ukraine. I mean, people often ask me this question. I don't know if you get this one. They'll say, yes, well, Ukraine, we know it's important. But then look over here. There's the Middle East. There's this, there's that. There's chaos all over the world. Or I say chaos superficially. Dig beneath the surface, and perhaps it's a little less chaotic, a little bit more by design. Why would you say that Ukraine and what's happening in Russia is strategically a greater priority than, say, maybe the Middle East is? That's putting aside the obvious, humanitarian issues of both conflicts.
Yeah, and obviously that depends on who you ask and where they happen to live, right? But just on a more macro scale, Ukraine is important because it is one, or at least what was perceived to be one very large, very powerful nation state with this huge military attacking a smaller country. And in the Middle East, while the conflicts are just as real and huge, we see much smaller forces at play comparatively. And the ability for the world to erupt into broader chaos outside of the actual region where the conflict is taking place, in my mind, is much greater because of Russia's war against Ukraine and the reasons that it's happening. I could go on a really long tangent about what's going on in the Middle East. I won't. I'll do a future video on that. I'm already planning it. But Russia in particular, when you look at what they're doing, it's clear that they're not just trying to get a little bit of Ukraine. It's pretty clear that it's the same type of empire building that we've always seen from Russia. It's kind of in their psyche. Putin kind of entered this war after COVID and reading all these Russian history books and kind of psyching himself up on this imperialistic idea. And so, what happens in Ukraine will ultimately impact what happens in Europe. And that has broader implications too when you look across the world and what's going on in China. Because if China perceives that Europe is caught up in this war, if their resources are overly invested there, China might decide to make moves in their corner of the world. And so, again, while the Middle East is terrible, what's happening there, the ability for the conflict to spiral out of control to me seems much greater with Russia's war against Ukraine.
Entirely, entirely agree. I mean, yeah, that you've stated that in a way I've been struggling to find the words to express that. And in fact, the foreign minister or deputy foreign minister, I think it was, of China, recently sort of gave the game away. The mask slipped when he was in Europe, and he basically said, yeah, as long as this conflict is going on, that there's a bleeding edge to Europe that is distracting the US and Europe from Asia. Now, of course, the big fear, which was articulated by Mark Rutte, Secretary General of NATO, is that actually there's more strategy behind this than we perhaps suspect, more strategy behind China's support for Russia. And indeed North Korea, which essentially are becoming vassals or proxies of Chinese foreign policy, and that
Hmm.
actually there is a scenario where China invades Taiwan and simultaneously Russia invades a NATO state, triggering Article 5. And in that situation, it's quite possible that both the US and Europe would be torn about which one to focus on and what to do.
Yeah, and I go back and forth on what is China's strategy. Sometimes I think they're aligned with Russia and want to do exactly what you say. Sometimes I think they just want to see Russia weakened as much as possible so that they can, take some of those eastern territories back, which I've analyzed in a lot of depth. It sounds kind of like propaganda to some people, but there's actually a lot of reasons to believe that's possible. But from a strategic standpoint, obviously we should prepare for the worst case scenario, and the scenario you've just laid out is totally plausible. And that's something that everybody should be thinking about. Like we are in the age again, of global powers and global wars. And a lot of people, just like the first two global wars, are not going to realize that until we're already well on our way.
Do you have that sense as well? Because I have this sense quite frequently. And of course, you can't walk through London without seeing signs of the Blitz and the last war, its impact on London. Either it's a space where a building's missing, and you've seen photos of what it used to look like, or many of the museums actually have, and public buildings have. If you look up the stonework, you can see the sort of shrapnel damage to the stone. Some of it hasn't been fixed; it's there as a sort of memorial. So it has very distinct echoes. My own grandparents on my father's side escaped Nazi tyranny just before it all kicked off in 1938, 1939. So to me, the echoes of the 1930s have been ringing pretty loudly since not just 22, but also 2014.
Yep.
The US, of course, didn't have that war on its territory. Do you think that's perhaps why it seems a little distant and that those echoes of history perhaps aren't beating quite so loudly for many in the US?
Yeah, as an American, there's a lot of people, Americans who love history, right? There's far more who don't. And there's a huge divide between the two. There's people who know a whole lot about history and they're super invested, and there's people who know nothing at all. And I think the vast majority really don't understand what led to World War II. That's a sense that I have among my whole country. People kind of know what happened. They don't know what caused World War II. They know that we were attacked by Japan and we entered the war. They know something about the Nazis and the Holocaust. They don't fully realize that, we didn't really know that that's what was going on when we entered the war. That's not why we entered the war. Um, and I see what concerns me a lot as far as recurrence is propaganda in my country and conspiracy theories and things like that because I've studied a lot of Nazi German history and these are the types of things that the Nazis used to kind of convince people that they were necessary, that there was this global conspiracy and all that. And actually, my family, this is just an interesting side note. We were a big part of that. Obviously, my last name is Warburg. I'm not super connected to the side of the family this happened to, but I am related. My family was one of these Jewish families that was named by Hitler as, these global conspirators because we had Warburgs on the German side at the end of World War II who were part of the delegation to negotiate Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles. And meanwhile, in the United States, you had Paul Warburg, my same name, different Paul Warburg, sorry guys, who founded the Federal Reserve. And, people were looking at this saying, well, there's this Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. Look, they're working in the United States to take over the monetary system. They are working in Europe to negotiate these treaties to take down the German people. And of course, none of that was true, but so many people believed it. And so, with that as my family history, it's made me sensitive and like alert to a lot of the conspiracy theories that get spread across my country today and how those are being used to create fear in people. And I don't know if there's like a bigger agenda to that. It's more just that people don't realize where that can lead if they're focused on that instead of actual history. And it's not leading us to a good place. And it's definitely making us blind to what's actually going on in the world because we're more focused on the conspiracy theories instead of the reality that's undeniable in front of us.
And that's the interesting chicken and egg question, which I guess historians are going to sort of debate and which might be on exam papers, which is, what came first? Was it the algorithms that weaponized people, that segmented them and subdivided them and destroyed a sense of common narrative that was a key factor in eroding, the nation state, eroding democracy? Or was it the autocrats that arose and dealt the death blow to it? Well, that's the worst case scenario. But it's an interesting one, isn't it? Whether these are simultaneous phenomenon or whether it is just lucky in some ways for the autocrats that the internet and its weaponized algorithms, actually products of rampant capitalism have come along and they've been able to weaponize these technologies.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting question. I think about it. I don't think these things could be successful, unfortunately, if there wasn't something in our human nature that was inclined in that direction. And obviously, there's people who are willing to manipulate it. And obviously, I just don't know the answer. All of the things above you said could be true. I think typically in human history, things like algorithms, they're not invented with a nefarious purpose. They're just invented maybe with a profit motive, which is kind of, just amoral. It's not totally evil. It's not totally good. And obviously they get misused. And what we do know is they have been misused and we can see how they're misused. And that's where the real problem lies, right?
That's it. And the outcomes of that algorithmic action is maybe something that the inventors of those things couldn't predict, or Zuckerberg and others. I guess the moral argument would be that once it's clear that these are emergent properties from those enterprises and what they've built, then they should have some sort of moral guidance to change and amend it and ameliorate the effects of those. Whereas quite the opposite seems to have happened. They've doubled down on them because clearly it's very, very profitable to do so. That's and there's oh boy, there's the whole free speech kind of it's a hot mess, that whole kind of topic there. But certainly
It, it,
Russia is able to weaponize this information environment and combine it with more traditional KGB techniques, which maybe in the Cold War we were more aware of, but we've sort of, I don't know, do you get the sense we've dropped the ball a little bit and maybe been a little naive?
yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that's actually kind of where I was going when I was mentioning that conspiracy theory concern I have in the United States. I didn't quite land the plane, but you definitely see in the United States Russian influenced arguments getting into our social media and getting believed. And the problem with humans, it's like a glitch in our psychology. The first thing that we believe, whether there's any reason we believe it or not, we're going to hold on to that really strongly. And anything we hear contrary to that is going to sound kind of wacko and conspiracy until we actually have more knowledge. And Russia has definitely taken advantage of that to kind of take a first strike at our thinking space as Americans. I've said this for a long time. Russia knows they cannot defeat the United States in a traditional war. It's impossible. And so they have to do these other types of strategies where instead of fighting us, they just take our chips off the table by convincing us to not get involved. And they've been incredibly successful. Whether or not things change soon, we'll see. But for the last 3.5 years, they've been incredibly successful.
Now, I'm
You
always
can,
fascinated by, especially as someone who say you've come to this without being particularly, either interested or partisan in politics, but you have got a grounding in history. You're interested in that, languages of the cultures. I'm always fascinated by someone who doesn't come this position from, someone who necessarily speaks Russian or Ukrainian or who has sort of, really studied those areas in depth. I'm always fascinated by what their impression of Russia is and what they've actually learned over the last 3 years that has sort of surprised them and terrified them, let's face it, about Russia and maybe the positive stuff about Ukraine. I knew very little about Ukraine actually until this
yeah.
all kicked off, and it's been a tremendous learning circle.
Yeah, I think there's a before and there's an after. So before I really got involved in this, here in the United States, we kind of think of Russia, we just think of the whole Soviet Union. And we kind of attribute everything that existed in the Soviet Union to Russia. And there's actually not strong knowledge of what the Soviet Union actually was in the US. I actually created a video just 2 days ago because of this called Russia is not the Soviet Union. It's much worse. But before I kind of learned all these things, my thinking of Russia, like everybody else, it's developed by the media that you consume and the popular media that most people consume about Russia is, military movies, maybe even video games, portraying them as a superpower. You have Red Dawn, you have Hunt for Red October, you have Top Gun, even where the opponent isn't Russia, but if we're honest, it's Russia, right? And so you go in and you think Russia is this big, powerful superpower, and then the more you learn about it, and the more you ask other people from post-Soviet states, they say Russia isn't a superpower. They're an empire that lost their superpower. they lost all their Soviet satellites that were creating most of what we perceive as these amazing Russian advances. And that's become more and more of my perspective, especially just seeing how Russia descended into oligarchy so quickly following the collapse of the Soviet Union, and how that oligarchy is functioning with this war against Ukraine and the tactics they're using. They're very empire-like. And so my impression of Russia is a group of people. I think a lot of Russians are incredible people, and the ones that I've met in the United States are incredible people, but who are ruled by an empire, ruled by an autocrat, who, to a large extent, are succumbing to the propaganda of that empire. And unfortunately, a lot of them are propagators of that, and a lot of them are also victims of that. And it's kind of sad. I guess if I were to sum up in one word what I think of modern Russia, it's sad.
And the idea that it not only won't make progress towards becoming a more, let's say, even the word I would call it a civilized, but certainly a wealthier and more stable society, that can't happen until it gets beyond the imperial phase and starts, dare I say, it, decolonizing its mentality. But also until that imperial phase has utterly spent itself, then the war in Ukraine, I suspect, won't end as well. Which leads to an interesting conclusion, which is that as long as Putin is there and someone like Putin in this imperial entity, then we will continue to see the kind of aggression we're seeing directed not just at Ukraine, but possibly at other countries too.
Yeah, I agree. At a high level, I think there is hope, and there's a few aspects of what's going on in Russia that are a little different than what we've seen in the past. You know, Russia does have access to the internet, and while they try to block things, they can't block everything. And I think a lot of Russians privately disagree with what's going on, but they can't come out and say that. I think another Russian leader that, if they were to be brought in, they would probably have the same mentality as Putin, but they'd have one big advantage, which is they didn't start this stupid war. So they would have an easier job removing themselves from that and recognizing the potential pitfalls of that to their own power. So there is a scenario where things aren't as bad as they could possibly be, and where if there is a change in the regime in Russia, we could see positive steps. I don't know where those would ultimately lead, but there's also a scenario, like you said, where if the fundamentals don't change, um, the system that created this war we're seeing today, if that system still exists, it's going to resuscitate, it's going to resurrect itself, because this is not what Putin is doing. It's not a new human instinct. It's actually a very old human instinct. And if we look across history, it's not rare, it's predominant. It feels more rare today to us who live in democratic societies, right? Because that's not what we do. That's not the lens through which we view the world, but it was for most people in the past. And so if you still are existing in a system that hasn't gotten past that, it's gonna resurrect itself, I think, in the long term.
That's it. I mean, a book that gives exactly that sense you're talking about is one about Jerusalem. I think the title is just that, Jerusalem. And it's, I struggle to get through it because it's literally invasion, 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 over and over, decade after decade after decade, over centuries and centuries. And it, as you say, it's just that impulse of, imperial control sweeping from one side to another and different empires, scrabbling for control. And in the meantime, people just buckle up and live their lives, or they cities get erased repeatedly and they have to rebuild it.
Yes.
But we're not used to that. And in that sense, Russia is actually it's quite good at being an empire in that it's quite brutish. It steals the culture, resources, and brains of the people that it occupies, but it also eradicates their culture, suppresses their culture, eradicates their languages. It's not an empire under which countries can flourish. And people might say, well, hang a second, what empire in history have people flourished in? But I think that is far too simplistic. I mean, if you look at let's say, the Roman baths in Britain, you'll have British gods fused with Roman architecture. Some empires have had a degree of tolerance within certain limits for local cultures, and sometimes they've incorporated them. Sometimes those cultures have actually sort of flourished within an imperial structure. Obviously, when you resist them, that's different. They'll wipe you out. I mean, that's always the case. But Russia seems to be particularly destructive, a particularly parasitic empire. In that respect, you've done a lot of videos, as have I, about how the regime is becoming fragile, that it's literally burning up its resources in this pursuit of imperialism. Now, I know we produce these because the algorithm loves them, and they do really well. But I also think it's tapping into a reality which is actually really rather interesting and compelling.
Yeah, absolutely. Every regime is fragile, right? And something I use a phrase I use in a lot of aspects of life is what you win them with is what you have to keep them with. And so if you're a regime that wins people to your position through force or through, exertion over your population, in order to keep that population totally under your boot, you have to be able to continue doing that. And obviously, in so many ways, the Putin regime has become weakened. I mean, we have a million casualties in Ukraine. We have the economic standpoint. And, the video I released yesterday was actually, I think Putin might be sort of trapped in his war because he's in sort of a position now where he's kind of damned if he does, damned if he doesn't. If he ends the war, that's going to create immediate short-term problems in Russia that might actually be more dangerous for his regime than continuing the war. But obviously, in the long term, the war is what's causing things to build up and potentially reach ahead. And so it's a very vulnerable position, and there's really no way out that Putin can say with 100% certainty, yeah, if I make this choice, my regime is going to survive. And I don't know exactly, what would happen, but I do know early on in this war, what a lot of people have forgotten is we already saw, for example, like Prigozhin's march on Moscow. And obviously that failed, but that was really early in the war where sentiment in Russia was really high. Most people still thought they were winning and all sorts of things. And he may have failed to get people to join the cause then. But I think now here we are, 3 years after that, or roughly 3 years after that, if more time progresses and another one of these Prigozhin type characters rises up, it's not unreasonable to say they might be more successful. You also have oligarchs surrounding Putin who are obviously getting increasingly frustrated because they became oligarchs to become wealthy, to get easy money, not to, kind of risk everything they have in these foreign adventures, and something could come across that way. There could just be Russian people not willing to support Putin's objectives anymore, not willing to sign up for his war. And that could lead to all sorts of things. But in so many ways, the regime is definitely fragile. We don't know exactly where that fracture point or that breaking point could be, but it can't last forever. And that's what I always remind people. Nothing can last forever.
And
Things can
especially
sometimes,
not the way he's populating his army,
yeah,
with inflationary sort of pay bonuses to sign up. And then with the amount of people getting killed, that's a huge expense.
exactly.
But he's baked into that as well, hasn't he? He's chosen a pretty inefficient way to populate his army, and I guess he's done it for politically expedient reasons because he can't inspire people to serve through some kind of compelling ideology. It's quite the opposite of why, let's say, people will go and serve in the US Army. There isn't that sense of honor, there isn't that sense of service that people are willing to sacrifice what could be a maybe a more beneficial
Mhm.
career monetarily in commerce, but no, they choose to serve because of values. I don't get the impression he can use that. So he's had to use basic bribery, for want of a better word.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And I'll even make a distinction. Like a lot of people will say in the US military, well, you guys have large signing bonuses. Why is that any different from what Putin does? And it's like, well, no, in the US military, we have large signing bonuses for specific specialties that are difficult to fill. But for, your basic infantryman or your basic Marine, typically there's not a huge signing bonus to get people to do that. It's just for specific jobs. The point you raise is very important. And you have to think about why is Putin approaching filling his military this way? Why hasn't he done something, for example, like conscription, um, to kind of force people to fight? Couldn't he just do that? And the answer is, maybe in his mind, maybe no. Um, Maybe he knows something about the security of his own power that we should listen to, which is if I try to force the Russian people to do something they don't want to do, they could react very poorly to that and it might backfire. So what is the tactic he's using? He's using this economic tactic, which is I'm going to pay people a lot of money to get them to want to fight because there's, not a lot of great jobs in Russia, especially after sanctions, unless you're working in the defense industry. Um, and so you have people joining for this boatload of money, and eventually that's going to fizzle out. But again, it's a long term, in the long term, the economics fizzle out, and not in the short term, but it is this idea that Putin is kind of trapped in his war because the tactics he's using, eventually they're going to run out of steam. And when you can't offer a Russian soldier a massive paycheck to come fight for you anymore, what do you turn to next? Do you then turn to conscription? And by that point, are you already too weakened? And does that cause something to happen? Who knows?
It's interesting, isn't it? And one of the arguments that from the so-called realist geopolitical school, which I have almost zero respect for because they just seem to get everything horrifically wrong and deny that morality plays any part in geopolitics. But you hear this refrain that, well, all wars end in negotiation, blah, blah, blah. That's really not necessarily true. I mean, the Second War didn't end in negotiation. It ended in the death of Hitler and some of his leading Nazis and the absolute collapse of his regime. The First World War was, yes, a negotiated solution, but only after Germany had economically collapsed and wasn't able to keep that war going. Vietnam ended, yes, but it ended by, the US basically getting kicked out. And there are many other wars, including Afghanistan, where we all got kicked out, right? Multiple times. The British got kicked out several times through history and got our butts kicked. So this idea of negotiation really seems like a bit of a red herring in the circumstances for another reason as well, which is all the pronouncements of Lavrov and Putin and all his mouthpieces suggest there is no concessions, not only on the table, but even possible with that regime. I mean, they are repeating their absolute maximalist, nonsensical arguments that Ukraine must be completely demilitarized and denazified, or whatever that means, given that they have, a number of Jews in the cabinet and the president is Jewish is just grotesque on every level. So what's your take on that? I mean, is this going to go on until there is some black swan type event, maybe?
What I like to say a lot is negotiation is a defeat in a different name, right? And you pointed it out perfectly with World War One. Who do you ask about whether this was a defeat or a negotiation? Well, in a sense, it was both. Germany negotiated because it was defeated. And and I think that when we look at wars at this scale, that's what we see. You look at a lot of smaller conflicts throughout history, and if you want to pull up the raw numbers, you could say, yeah, most conflicts ended because of negotiation. But the circumstances surrounding those were so different than what we see here with a nation state entirely involved in a war, not just a king and a ruler in the military class and they didn't win a battle, so they were forced to negotiate, but instead the regime is entirely encumbered in this war. And again, you have to look at the psychology of what they're doing and whether a negotiation would address the underlying psychology and the underlying reasons behind the war. Sometimes it's true. In this case, it's fundamentally not true because you can't negotiate based on lies. That's just admitting defeat. And all of the reasons that Putin has given for invading the war and all of his demands to end the war, they're based on lies. And so you can't unfortunately come to a negotiated settlement based on something like that because we know from history rulers who do that sort of thing, when you negotiate with them and give them what they want, they just come back and take more later. So I don't know ultimately how this will end. My thesis that I put forth in most of my videos is that it's going to get uglier and uglier and uglier and uglier. And Russia is going to have to come to a point of basically total military defeat or point of regime change for this to ultimately be ended, unfortunately. And that's not the answer like I want to give, which a lot of people misunderstand. That's the answer I arrive at when I look carefully at everything that's going on and I think carefully about all the alternatives. And this seems like the most plausible answer. It doesn't matter if I like it or not.
Completely, that really resonates for me as well. That's my anticipated thing here, and that leads into really the next question so perfectly because it seems that Putin has no real sense that he is losing. He may have a sense that he's not achieving his goals, but I don't think he has a sense he's losing. And indeed, his political structure may make it impossible for his deputies and generals and whatever to pass any true picture of reality up to him. They'll fall out of windows if they tell him the unvarnished truth.
Mm.
So he's partly living with his own delusions and partly with poor information as well, and the extreme hubris that leads him to carry on.
Yeah.
When you see, I mean, there's two announcements recently that are quite interesting. One is by a horrific Russian war criminal, but also happens to be someone who is quite analytical in his thinking, called Igor Gerkin-Strelkov. He's in prison at the behest of the Kremlin at the moment for opposing the regime, and one of his associates is called Maxim Kalashnikov. Both of them have suggested that this summer offensive, Putin's going to throw everything into it. That Putin has this idea that he can overcome Ukraine, and that he can win his maximalist goals, and that this is the final throw of the dice. He may be aware that once this is done, then he will not be able to mount any other operation, and this is going to come in the summer, early autumn, and we're already seeing some signs of that, although it's not making much progress. But they are going to try and rustle up as many bodies as they can. That they are One of the negotiations is to get these 30,000 North Korean combat troops to replace all of Russia's border guards to basically guard the frontiers of Russia, so they can rustle up all those ethnic Russian bodies and send them into the fight. This sounds like this could be a critical point of inflection, the make or break you were talking about of Putin's regime, if, as I suspect, this offensive is going to result in absolute carnage on the Russian side.
Yeah, it's a great theory, and I agree it would result in absolute carnage on the Russian side. We've already seen that those tactics don't really work in this war. They might work to get small incremental gains of territory over time, but when you're just throwing people on the battlefield, this is a different kind of war. This is drone warfare, and it's not going to help Putin achieve his objectives. And if he's paid attention at any point in this war, he would know that because those are the tactics he's already been using and they haven't worked. Um, so the theory is plausible, and I think it holds water. I would propose a potential alternative adjustment to that, where I would say I think Putin might actually know he's losing, and that might be why he's using tactics like that. When we look at some of the recent things Putin has done, which have been quite surprising, he has actually gone to the Russian people and said, we're going to lower the Russian military budget next year. And you can actually read a lot into this because obviously Russia is going to spend everything more positively than the reality suggests. And so for Putin to be going to the Russian people and kind of admitting that the military spending is causing a strain on the economy, it shows that Putin knows that this is something the Russian people are potentially frustrated about, and he's trying to kind of prolong the ability for them to support him. So in Putin's calculus, he knows that the economy isn't going to last forever. He also knows if he loses the war, his regime is over, and probably his life is over. And so when I see an offensive like this, it could be because Putin thinks he can win the war. It could also be because he really does think he's losing, and he's really trying to put everything on the line for a final push, because he knows that if this war lasts another year and a half, another 2 years, another 3 years, his ability to support it economically is going to be greatly deteriorated beyond what it already is. I mean, their war chest is running out, and all sorts of other things. And so that would be more how I would interpret a major summer offensive from Russia, kind of a desperate last stand.
And so we have a sort of tactical defeat potentially on the horizon for Putin. I mean, notwithstanding that is also going to cause some horrific losses on the Ukrainian side, but having seen some of the fortifications being built, now I haven't talked about that previously, but I have now seen some articles referencing this, so it's in the public domain. I mean, Ukraine is constructing vast systems of fortifications, 20 to 30 kilometers behind the zero line across most of the front. And unlike previous attempts, which were frankly, laughable and
Mhm.
ridiculous. These are clearly built with military strategy in mind and a very clear military specification. And I saw them with some ex-Polish military guys, and they were saying, yeah, this looks really solid. That's another good reason to suggest that Russia won't really be able to extend much more into Ukrainian territory.
Yeah, I totally agree. Um, and Ukraine is playing, kind of has to play kind of an interesting game with fortifications because the thing about building fortifications is if your fortifications are behind where Ukrainian civilians currently live, that kind of sends a message to those people that if Russia pushes, we're going to vacate where you're at and kind of leave you and go to a different fortified position. And that might be why there's been some hesitation. It's the only plausible reason I can think why there's been some hesitation on Ukraine's side to really build these fortifications because they don't want any Ukrainian people to feel abandoned. But
Yeah.
to your point, as they build these, yeah,
And
they're
there are
they're
settlements. There's many, many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people in towns and villages in between, as you say, these defensive areas.
exactly. So, I don't think Russia's going to be able to push through something like that. We've already seen in this war, Russia initially invaded Ukraine and they took a lot of territory because these things didn't quite exist yet. But as soon as Ukraine kind of pushed Russia back, Russia really hasn't been able to push back in, and they haven't faced something like this. And so I think, as long as Ukraine has continued to be provided sufficient ammunition, sufficient support, they can definitely withhold and hold back the tide of the summer offensive.
And the last sort of question there, which to zoom back out again. So whereas Putin may be faced with a significant tactical defeat, possibly even uh, a sort of collapse of his regime in some sense, we don't know, but that's not off the table. Unfortunately, in other ways, he has had some extraordinary victories. I mean, he has clearly been able to place voices. Whether they're assets, agents, or just useful idiots is a subject of endless debate. But he's clearly been able to inject narratives into the US political system and indeed into many European countries that have sown division, have caused distrust, have caused, in some ways, democracies to lose their cohesion and lose, as I mentioned earlier, there's a commonality of narratives that we had in the Cold War that meant we were resilient. He's done that. He's also severely degraded, along with his authoritarian allies, a whole raft of international bodies that were designed to bring the world towards a much more progressive future, in the wake of the Second World War. So longer term, Putin, I think, clearly has had an extraordinary impact in changing the direction of history. Now, I would argue that it's not a good change and it's not a good direction it's going in, but he seems to have been instrumental in doing that, and also he seems to be instrumental in persuading China to go down a far more aggressive path internationally as well.
Yeah, there's two ways to look at this. He's certainly trying to do that, and some of the changes are evident. We don't yet know what the long-term outcome of those changes will be. And so, just for example, in the United States, I've seen a huge change in sentiment where, like 3 years ago, I tend to run in Republican circles. 3 years ago, most Republicans would have been not in favor of supporting Ukraine. They would have, some of them even been for Russia and said like any pro-Ukraine stance is literally just like liberal propaganda, that kind of thinking. That's completely changed. Those narratives have progressively been undermined in people's thinking as they've seen events play out over time. And so I do have a sense of hope that, it's easy to build up narratives in the short term and get a lot of people to buy into them. It's a lot harder to get people to continue believing lies for years and years and years. We know that it can be done. It has been done. But even in the United States prior to World War II, there was an actual Nazi movement in the United States. And today that would be unthinkable, right? Because people process these things, they process these thoughts, and society kind of vomited them out and got rid of them. And so my hope is that that's what's ultimately going to happen um, once this war is no longer in the picture, once there's no longer literally a national government spending billions of dollars a year to influence people's thinking. hopefully the facts can start to speak for themselves. And that's kind of why I do what I do on my channel, because eventually we're going to need people who have processed these facts to help kind of lead the thinking out of this Russian influenced mindset.
And a lot of voices will go curiously quiet when the flows of money from the Kremlin stop.
Exactly.
Fortunately, your voice is not one of those. It will continue to ring out because
Yes.
we're not getting bags of cash from well either
Any,
the FSB or the FBI. So
it depends who you ask. I get a lot of comments who swear I'm funded by the CIA.
yes, that's it. And then the NATO guys use that as a bit of an ironic thing, isn't it? They post all of their, based in Langley, Virginia, as their little mock
I
trolling kind of thing there.
love
But that's yeah, that's an important idea, and I think you've managed to land this episode on actually quite a positive note, which is that once liars, autocrats, and grifters stop paying for those lies or find themselves incapable of paying for it, then it's worth working on more truthful narratives because they'll have a chance to really blossom when the autocrats run out of cash, which fingers crossed comes soon.
the darkness cannot overcome the light. The light overcomes the darkness. And I believe that in all aspects of my life. So
That's a wonderful place to end. Paul, thank you for all your work and especially for bringing us to, I think, such an optimistic outcome there, which we need to cling on to in relatively dark times like these. I know the audience is going to really, wish you the best and all the energy that you need to create the fantastic content you're creating. For today, though, thank you so much for coming on to Silicon Curtain.
thanks so much for having me, Jonathan. Love watching your show. So super happy to be on it. And hopefully we can talk again sometime.
Definitely will do.